Sir, can you give me your name and job title, please?
Tim Wigmore. I'm the author of Crickonomics, The Anatomy of Modern Cricket, and I work for the Daily Telegraph.
There was just a pause there where I wasn't sure if you remembered who you were, which I really appreciate. Well, I was going to get you on probably to talk about this topic anyway, and then England have decided to change how Test cricket is played. Just in a very brief explanation, how would you explain the concept of Bazball? Are we all in on Bazball, by the way? I don't know who invented the phrase Bazball, but it feels like that's just become the term.
It was Andrew Miller in his first piece when McCullum joined as coach. He coined it there and then. So fair play to him. But Bazball in a nutshell, it's scoring really, really, really quickly and basically trusting in one-day skills to play Test cricket in a different way, because England have played a lot of very conventional and not very good Test cricket in the last few years.
And this all leads into your book, Crickonomics, where you talk about how Test rates have risen. So let's go back to the Sri Lankan 98 Test.
Yeah, so Sri Lanka at the Oval, 1998. And we remember it as the Murali Test. He gets these 16 wickets, and obviously that's part of the story, but it's only half the story.
Sorry. Are you there?
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. No, there's a problem with my mic.
Okay,
so what's the other half of the story, Wigmore? Don't tease people.
Yeah. No, it's a little just getting you in gently. So the other half of the story, Sri Lanka score incredibly quickly. And they managed to get a lead of 140 odd in the first innings while batting fewer overs than England. And if you look at that test, Sri Lanka need 287 overs to get 20 English wickets. So it's 3 days and an hour of bowling and only a day and 3/4 of batting. And that's because they score so quickly. So I think that is the most anyone has bowled in a test and still won since 1955, which is going back to over eights and stuff being a different complexion. So it's a real it's a really radical way of playing, and that's with Jayasuriya and De Silva. And that they actually beat Australia in a similar way the following year in a kind of a very low scoring test at home. But what happens is, again, Sri Lanka bat for fewer overs than Australia and end up winning. So Sri Lanka beat Australia by 6 wickets, and they only bat for 93 overs in the match, and Australia bat for 127. So that's a kind of low scoring equivalent of the Oval.
And it's really, from memory, it's from basically World War I onwards that runs per over are pretty flat. They're beneath 3 runs and over, even if you account for 8 ball overs and everything. There's a couple of spikes earlier on in cricket, which I think are some faster scoring test matches, in years where there wasn't a lot. But also, I think some of those tests might have been on matting as well, which is obviously, can allow for faster scoring. Sometimes you don't have to worry about
and there's a very uneven quality of opponents. So if you're playing South Africa early, if a year of a lot of playing them, that probably impacts the overall numbers a lot as well.
No, exactly. So I think all those things are there. Let's go to Sri Lanka, though. You got a theory in the book why Sri Lanka bat more attacking than other places.
Yeah, so there's 2 things that stand out about Sri Lanka. Firstly, they're the first Test team to get status through ODI cricket, basically. So one-day cricket is a disproportionately important part of their early development as a kind of cricket culture. And then you look at the schools themselves. Well, the schools, like in a lot of countries, like in England, the batters tend to come from elite schools in Sri Lanka, and they play. Each private school really has big match, which is a really prominent match against a rival school, which is 2 or 3 days, but it's normally only 2 days, and it's 2 innings side cricket over 2 days. And so the only way you've got any chance of winning is by scoring really, really quickly. So that lends itself to a type of players. We talk with Dilip Mendes, and he talks about, and he plays some really very, very fast-scoring innings in Test cricket, including at Lord's in 1984. And he says he's really importing the style of play from big match into Test cricket. So that definitely seems to play a part in Sri Lanka. Those 2 factors together.
And And the other thing that you mentioned was the whistle stop tours of teams when they would, so basically when they would go by boat in the ye olde days, they would stop in Sri Lanka on the way there because it was in a good position for the boats. And they would usually play one-day games, but they would be multiple innings one-day games.
Yeah, so there was no chance of a result. So like England stopped on the way to the borderline tour. Even they stopped for a day. There's no chance of a result. So it's all about trying to entertain as much as possible, which is playing in this buccaneering style. So yeah, these sort of three factors together give Sri Lankan kind of cricket quite an unusual dimension in terms of the role of batters, and that I think you can actually draw a line from that. Right up until Jayasuriya and also the World Cup victory in 1996.
I think even if you go back, I'm trying to remember his name, but there was a Sri Lankan who made a lot of runs against the MCC way back when. He might have even played in England a little bit, who was attacking. Like, it seems to be that for whatever reason, the way their cricket developed was a more attacking batting style than other countries had anyway. And then you factor in all these different things. There does seem to be... And if you look at it now and you compare them to New Zealand, they were probably held back from Test cricket for 30 or 40 years, longer than they should have been. And so New Zealand sort of just become a Test nation and develop, whereas Sri Lanka developed completely outside mainstream cricket.
Yeah, and of course, so if you look at New Zealand, they're being promoted and they're not very good for a long time. So their style is it's clinging on. It's stereotypically New Zealand. It's until Brendon McCullum, who we'll probably come on to later, but it's that very kind of grim play. Whereas Sri Lanka, if you just think they're winning way more of the matches they're playing than New Zealand are in their equivalent stage of development, just because they're not a Test team. So again, that also encourages this more adventurous play, and I suppose the way for them to dominate at a slightly lower level was to play this very adventurous attacking style of cricket. And then when they actually get to Test level, even though they're obviously not particularly strong at the start, but they are probably a lot stronger than, say, when New Zealand get Test status, which means that style of batting, it doesn't need to be torn up in a way that with New Zealand it was very much about how can we survive, because New Zealand were often playing 4-day matches and their aim was just to basically grind out a draw in a 4-day Test.
Yeah, 3-day matches, and still I'm trying to work out how to survive. So you mentioned Sanath Jayasuriya and Ramesh Kalawitharana before. So I was at the MCG for when Murali was called, and for that whole Test match. And I remember watching Kalawitharana, and I was playing representative cricket at the time, and I went back and all the kids were talking about the game, and I was like, and someone said, well, what was the best innings? And I was like, Kalawitharana. And I think that might have been when Ponting might have made 100, David Boone might have made 100, and everyone there was looking at me crazy, and I was like, yeah, but they batted normally. You have to go back and watch Kalawitharana in that innings to be like, this is not normal Test batting. And it was obviously on the back of that they ended up opening the batting with them in the series in Australia, where they played really, really good cricket. That leads on to the World Cup, which kind of changes everything. How they ended up with Sanath Jayasuriya is quite interesting, though, isn't it?
Yeah, so he starts out really as a number 8 or 9, a left-arm spinner who can whack some handy runs down the order. And it's actually the Boxing Day Test. He's only opened in one previous Test match. He's been playing for about 4 years at that point. 16 Tests, in fact. So normally batting at 6. And he started to do well in ODIs opening, and Sri Lanka, they just give him the chance to do the same. And he whacks a century at basically a run a ball, which is really kind of pretty mad in those times, and that's Sri Lanka is still very well beaten anyway, but that's the glimpse of that, the ODI approach actually working in Test cricket as well. And I suppose that Sri Lankan pitches actually generally is not a huge amount of seam and swing early on, so it's a good place to be an aggressive opening batsman.
And they take that to another level in one-day games, though, don't they? Like, it does explode. So we had exciting one-day openers before. I mean, Keith Stackpole was probably one of the earlier versions of that. Chris Srikanth was another version of that. You then have Mark Greatbatch as well. So we had attacking opening batters before, and we'd had pinch hitters. Ian Botham had been a pinch hitter, right? The difference is the way that Sri Lanka fully committed to the attacking, especially in the power play.
Yeah, so there's not just one batsman who does this. They're kind of all in on it, and then the middle order have a different role. But yeah, I think other countries would have one player as a kind of joker and say you can go out. Doesn't really matter. The price of your wicket is less. But with Sri Lanka, they commit more, and teams don't really have a clue of how to respond. Actually, if you look at the World Cup, Jayasuriya does very well. The famous innings in the quarterfinal against England when he gets 80 in 40 balls. Romesh Battacharya doesn't get a huge amount of runs. Often he gets a kind of quick 15 off 8 balls kind of innings. But that's okay as well, and that's still. So yeah, Jayasuriya is probably a higher caliber of batsman to have really done that role than any who'd done before. Because Ian Botham, when he was doing, wasn't of the same class as Jayasuriya. He was finished. He was towards the end, yeah. So
he was finished.
Yeah,
he was finished.
Yeah.
You could say Ian Botham was finished at that point. I think we all know he was finished.
So,
and also even when Great Batch and Shrikant, even David Boone did it a little bit for Australia. Like even when those players did it, they showed more intent in the way that Gordon Greenidge might have done. What they didn't do was literally try and break you in the power play. There was no thinking that was the goal. Within cricket to be able to break you within the power play, and I think that was a huge difference. Whereas Sri Lanka was saying, well, at the end of this power play, we might be 100 runs, and now you've got to work out what you need to do for the rest of the game.
Yeah, and in a way, their middle order, they had faith in their middle order to De Silva and so on. Although De Silva plays some very aggressive innings as well, but they have faith in middle order that they can control the game if need be, and you almost work backwards towards sort of 260. Say, even if we're 100 for 3 or 15, that's fine. We've then got enough to kind of to do whatever we need to be to get to our target, which is a very different way of going back to the tradition of ODI batting is very, very defensive. It's really you build and build and build, and over 50 overs you only really you want to have 7 wickets in hand after 35, 38 overs. So it's very much you build and build and build. And of course, in a way, that limits your ceiling, because if you build and build and build, you get to 140 for 2 or 36 overs, then you have 5 or 6 dodgy overs, lose a few wickets. Suddenly, you're only going to get 220 anyway, despite having all this build up. But if you go from the start suddenly and it comes off, you can get 300. So it's a different way of doing it. And of course, it also means things like, your opponents have to kind of bowl their better bowlers earlier, so that creates opportunities later as well. So you take the element of control. In a way that lots of ODI innings have been pretty kind of passive before, almost a formulaic way of building. And actually some of that probably stems from how ODI cricket started at 65 overs, and it was almost kind of just you just move back the time when you start to accelerate without realising actually with so many fewer overs you can do things very differently.
And so at this point in Test cricket, correct me if I'm wrong, we never had a scoring rate over 3 runs and over. I think that's right. Other than outlier years where there weren't many Test matches.
Yeah. So the last year with 3 runs and over before 2001 was 1921. So in the kind of mature,
which wouldn't have had many tests.
Yeah. And you have actually England being.
I don't think there's a year.
World War I and so on. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that one had 10 tests. Off the top of my head, because a lot of the earlier ones when I did my research don't even count because they don't even have 10 tests. And it's like, oh, look, the scoring rate, that year was like 4.2, and it's like in all 3 tests. So it was a little bit different. And Australia specifically at that point, despite being seen as a fairly aggressive team, having already won a World Cup, they weren't actually a very fast scoring test team at that point, Australia, were they?
Yeah, so go back to this test in Sri Lanka in 99. So Sri Lanka score at 3.53 and over in the match. Australia only at 2.57. So Sri Lanka is scoring at a run and over more than Australia here. And what happens if you look at the Australia team in the mid to late 90s? Actually, there's a number of matches where they are on top, but they aren't able to convert those games into victories. So we found from 97 to 99, there were 4 tests Australia drew, in which they got first innings leads of 149, 123, 110, and 28, and actually then set their opponents a target of 419. So basically, Australia is really on top of these games, but is not very efficient at converting this position into enough wins. Over these 4 games, Australia sometimes are scoring as low as 2.2 and over. So they're very much the old school Test cricket. Australia, from beating the West Indies in '95, kind of which symbolises when they become number 1 in the world. They score at 2.9 and over in the next 4 years, which is only actually 4th of Test teams in this time, with Sri Lanka as number 1. So Australia are playing good cricket, but they're not very distinct in terms of how they play. And then we have John Buchanan takes over, and his first presentation is basically about how can we climb Everest. That's the theme of the presentation. And as part of that, they do very deliberately talk about playing cricket in a more aggressive way. And of course, you have Adam Gilchrist that comes in. But one of the things, we might talk about Bazball more later, but I would argue that what England are doing now partly comes from a position of weakness. They've tried defensive batsmen, they haven't really worked. Australia's is different. Their position of strength, they already have a very good team. They're not always able to convert these dominant draws into victories. And so they're in a position where they can try and do something new, and with their quality, that should lead them to take the draw out of the equation, in which case they're going to be very, very hard to stop.
The interesting thing about Australia is you focus quite a bit on Gilchrist, and obviously he makes about a run a ball 80 in his first game before Shoaib Akhtar bowls an incredible Yorker to dismiss him. Which Shoaib Akhtar loves to show that Yorker online, but kind of always forgets that he'd been smashed everywhere. They'd been smashed everywhere before that. Then they go to Hobart and they're chasing 360, 369 off the top of my head. They're 5 for about 110. And Gilchrist comes in. And Gilchrist comes in, and a really, really interesting thing happens. And this is going to play completely into the Bazball generation when we talk about that. Is that instantly, Wasem Akram starts putting boundary riders out. Right? Gilchrist hasn't really done anything. And my memory is there were 3 boundary riders almost from his first ball. Now maybe it's not that. Maybe he hit a boundary or 2 early on. But this wasn't an era when we had boundary riders. There's a great, great old innings. It's worth looking at. I think it was Sobers in the 70s when he was playing for the rest of the world 11 versus Australia. And he makes a big double century. He's just hitting boundaries all day. It's like, if you watch that innings, it takes forever for the fielders to get out, right? He's like 170 when they start putting boundary riders out. Whereas for Gilchrist, it was completely different. And it's because Gilchrist had smashed Pakistan in that previous test, but also smashed him in so many one-day games and smashed everyone else in so many one-day games by that point. Everyone knew who he was and what he could do. But it completely scrambled the way that Pakistan were thinking about how they needed to bowl to him, right? The interesting thing about Gilchrist is you talk about Australia making a conscious effort to score quicker. I went back and had a look at Gilchrist's first 4 hundreds in first-class cricket. And you'll like this. The second first-class 100 he ever made was against Somerset, and Marcus Trescothick got him out. That's just a fun fact. We're just going to throw that in, but we don't even need to mention it anymore. But when you look at them, I think 3 of them are pretty close to run a ball. Right, there's a run a ball 180 in a Shield final, which is the one I remembered off the top of my head. But there were 2 others, I think, in England as well, that were very quick. Gilchrist didn't have to be told to score quickly. He was just that kind of player naturally, and had always been that. Even if you go back and look at his pre-first class stats, that's how he was. It's the rest of the team that's more interesting because they all get quicker, don't they?
Yeah, I think the best example of this is Justin Langer. So when Buchanan takes over, November 99, his strike rate is 41. He is your gritty left-handed battler, basically.
Dean Elgar.
And he's 29. He's 29 almost. So he kind of is what he is. Batsmen don't really tend to radically change at that point. But then the rest of his career, his strike rate is 58. So that's a massive shift. A 50% increase almost in his strike rate. And that, I think that's a really good example. Really good evidence, actually, that something concerted really is happening here. It's not just Gilchrist, as you said. It's other players already in the team, already established. They're starting to play differently as well.
So the Langer one's really interesting. So I always had this theory that teams played Langer incorrectly, right? What Langer would do is he'd take a bunch of risks early on and hit and slash a bunch of boundaries, and then it would still take him all day to get to his 100. So he would have a really good strike rate for the first 20, 30, maybe even 40 balls. A little bit, Shane Watson did a very similar thing. Even Michael Slater did a similar thing. And then the field would settle out, and they were like, well, there's only 2 slips in place now. So the chance of me getting an edge and being caught in the slip cordon is down, and there's not a bat pad anymore because they've had to put him into the offside or to mid wicket or whatever, and so a lot of it was performative. What Australia was doing. The other thing that I find really interesting, and in fact we'll go into it. So from there, when Australia start doing that, run rates go up everywhere, right? And in the book, you talk about there's two different theories. You obviously wrote this book with Stefan, and he believes you believe that Australia inspired other teams. And I think what Stefan and I believe is that actually it was one-day cricket and the one-day cricket's impact on Test cricket that actually changed scoring rates. And I'm going to tell you specifically how I think that happened. Essentially, what Australia did if you look at what Australia did in their revolution from 1987 through to their World Cup victories, boundaries weren't their most important thing. Their best thing was fitness, running between wickets, and everything else. You look at the players in the 90 Wigmore, there's a lot of guys who couldn't actually get to the other end for quick singles. There's a lot of players who didn't worry about singles at all. They would hit a boundary every couple of overs, and that was their form of attacking cricket. Converting ones into twos wasn't a thing. You go back and you can see a lot of cricket from the 70s, 80s, 60s. There are a lot of people who were walking and conserving energy. That's not always the case, though. If you go back and look at that cricket from the 30s, 40s, 50s, it's a little bit different. But certainly it was becoming that. I think that a lot of the extra fitness, the fact that teams were used to stealing singles and everything is part of the reason. I'm not saying Australia didn't inspire them because everyone was talking about Australia, so that certainly played a part. But I actually think the bigger change was probably just fitness levels and understanding that running between the wickets was really important.
Yeah, it's a combination of these two factors, I think, I give a bit more weight to Australia, Stefan, and you to ODIs, but I'm not saying the ODIs are not a factor as well. But I think the fact that we see teams, what is interesting, teams have access to one-day players. I think teams are more willing to promote players to Test cricket based on one-day form and actually to play in a certain way. So Marcus Trescothick makes his debut in 2000, which is less than a year after Adam Gilchrist kind of comes in. I think that's important. Sehwag makes his debut for India in 2001. And those guys are allowed to play not too dissimilar to how they play in one-day cricket. So I think what's happening is a kind of a combination. There's a pool of players there's a greater pool of players who've played international cricket and shown they can play in a bit more aggressive way, and suddenly Australia are doing it and it's working really well. And we have to remember that what England and Australia do in cricket history always matters more than other countries, unfortunately, because it gets more attention. And therefore I think in a way that even if Sri Lanka were doing it first, I think it's Australia that has a bigger impact on other teams actually copying them because they're more analysed and written and reported on and so on. And then, so yeah.
Well, also, I know...
Yeah,
I mean, Sri Lanka had won the World Cup by that stage, but they still didn't... They weren't a major force in Test cricket. They weren't playing as much Test cricket as anyone else.
I mean, they were actually but literally, if you were... Well, I was saying that video footage and stuff often non-existent, which is a big contrast to Australia.
Exactly. And if you look at the run rates, Australia were completely the dominant. They were the number one team in terms of run rates as well. So even if they were partly inspired by Sri Lanka, which is very, very possible, a lot of it is just that they did it better. They were a better team than Sri Lanka at that point. Sri Lanka had 5 or 6 incredible players, whereas Australia had a group of 15 players. So, but you're right about the history thing. There's absolutely no doubt. In fact, the history thing is, I think it's slightly misremembered as well. If you look at Gilchrist is thought to be the person who changed wicket-keeping batting when it comes to picking people who could bat. That's not what actually happens with Gilchrist at all. Andy Flower and Alex Stewart and Jeffrey Dujon were all picked because they could bat, right? They were all seen as frontline batters who could use the gloves. It didn't quite work for Dujon, but Alex Stewart and Andy Flower obviously did make it work, and other countries were starting to do similar things. What Gilchrist does, and this goes right back to that run rate thing, is Gilchrist is the one where they start picking attacking batters, right? Because now you're thinking, and now you're almost going back to traditional cricket. So traditionally, number 7 would be a player who would be like, Leary Constantine or I'm trying to think of some of the others, or Alan Davidson, these sorts of players who would come in and whack it, right? That was the position. It was like, you need to be able to bat a little bit, but really what we want is when the bowlers are tired, we want someone to come in and whack a quick 40 and then hopefully tie them, and put them off a little bit before the tail come in. that Gilchrist sort of did that, but at a higher level because he was a better batter, which meant that, England have been trying to copy that method, ever since. Obviously, Brad Haddon was the replacement, Brendon McCullum, a lot of Quinton de Kock, a lot of very attacking Dick Waller wicketkeepers exist
Pant.
now, Oh yeah, Dhoni Pant. I mean, there's Safras Ahmed is another one. Faster scoring players. When you look at the list now of I think it's the top 30 fastest scoring players since the year 2000. It's Tim Southey, Virender Sehwag, and a lot of wicketkeepers. Right? There's a lot of wicketkeepers at the top of that list, and I think that changed. And I think just putting that one position back in, which had sort of disappeared from cricket a little bit. I think that attacking number 7 or number 8 or whichever position it was. I think putting that one position in again has to give the run rates a bit of a jump up.
Yeah, so in the 1990s, the strike rate of wicket keepers is exactly the same as top 6 batters. So they are just picked as their batting is already becoming more important for sure. In fact, the averages increase as much from 80s to 90s as 90s to 2000 of keepers, but they are just being picked and playing as normal batters. And then suddenly that there is a hike in the strike rates of keepers compared to top 6 go up 3 points in the 2000s. So there is a shift in the type of keeper batters who come out, and possibly there's an obsession at times and kind of teams become too fixated on Australia, which is again the Australian thing, and it takes a while before we go back now to where I think teams want to have an aggressive keeper batsman, but they're not wedded to it in the same way. So you have Josh De Silva, you have BJ Watling, and teams find a way to deal with that as well. But in the 2000s, it's almost like you both need to be a good batter and you need to play in this particular way. And I think that is a Gilchrist effect on keeper batters more than a guy who can bat more, because it's already trending that way. England in the 90s, they already basically over the decade they kind of moved from Jack Russell, who's actually could bat a reasonable amount as well, to Stewart as keeper. So that's already happening. It's the aggression that is the shift, and I think we can attribute a lot of that just to Gilchrist himself.
Yeah, and once you put that one player in, that they really do lift the strike rate, and I suppose that takes us, that sort of takes us through to Gilchrist, to McCullum, because he is on the back end of that. But just before we get to him, the interesting thing is that I don't have the numbers in front of me, but my memory is that the top end rates, as far as runs per over, actually occur between 2007 and 2012. Does that sound right to you?
Yeah, so there's been
as far as
shift back.
Runs per over?
Yeah, that's right. There's been basically a shift back. Actually, I think it might have been from 08. 08 or so it goes down.
I should have my numbers in front of me too.
Should we get this on quick? It's quite a... Should we look it up quickly?
Yeah, I've got it on my blog. Where is it?
Because the good thing is last year, was the slowest year, I think, since 01.
Yeah, it was.
Which is interesting.
So I think the peak year is 08, 09, and then there's a little dip, and then it gets big again in 2012, is it? 2013? 2013. And now we've had dips again. Although 2020 was actually really high, even though no one made any runs. So do you want me? I'll lead in with that now. You ready?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you look at it, I was close. It's 08, 09, which are incredibly high scoring years as well in that sort of period. But also, if you look at between 2003 for quite a few years, it's almost about 7 years. From 2002 through to 2009, 2010. Then we have a dip in the run rate, runs per over for a little while. Then it goes back up again almost straight away. And then as the wickets start to fall massively, runs per over does come down. Although there is one hilarious year in 2020 when the run rate is one of the highest we've ever had and no one's making any runs, which is completely bizarre. But essentially in the T20 era, which is really post 2008, it was actually went a little bit slower than the 10 years before. So T20 cricket specifically, so far, Wigmore, has not really affected runs per over in test matches that we can tell.
No, there's no impact at all. From the outside that you can tell, which is very interesting. Everyone's saying it's ruining Test batting and everything. Well, I suppose you could argue it's made defences less good because people don't practice it as much. But really, you could say with specialisation and so on, at least we had been until this summer moving towards more distinct players. You also the quality of fast bowlers especially has been phenomenal in recent years, and the level of skill and fitness also. You don't get as many kind of fifth bowler overs being bowled now as before. And the pitches have been spicy really. So yeah, it's very hard to say T20 has up until now had any impact on run rates.
Yeah, I think just because it's my podcast and we can't have a whole podcast without me mentioning this, the wobble ball has obviously played a very big part in all of that as well. So we come through here now to McCullum. So I did a deep dive on McCullum, the batter. And one thing that you notice with him is I think he's got about the 7th or 8th highest strike rate. And this is from 1980 onwards, so there might have been some older players out there. But he's got about 7th or 8th highest strike rate in Test cricket of people over 5,000 Test runs. But it's a long way short of Sehwag and Gilchrist. I think they're both both in the 80s, and he's around 65. So he's upper echelon all time, but nowhere near the really, really dynamic scorers. But when you look at the innings that he has played, and you look at the fastest scoring innings of all time, over 50 overs, New Zealand's on that list a lot, and they're almost entirely down to him playing an absolutely huge inning. So I think they're on it 6 times when he bats, and of those 6 times, he has a strike rate of over 90. 5 of the times. There's only one innings where he's not a driving factor in the strike rate. But he wasn't a Shahid Afridi or Sehwag or Gilchrist level attacker. He picked and chose when he was going to attack.
Me? Yeah.
Yeah, you. Wigmore.
Sorry, I thought you were just carrying on. Yeah. I mean, his strike rate is 64, which is on the high side, but it's not insane. Of course, he does play. He scores a triple century in 13 hours. Like, he can play a different way. He's also says BJ Watling is his favourite player at one point, who is pretty much the antithesis of what we think of as Bazball. So there's a bit more pragmatism there than some people think.
I think the interesting thing with him is when he wanted to play in that method, the sort of Tassie Devil style of batting, what you notice is that teams don't know what to do to him. It doesn't matter if it's a T20 game, a one-day game, or a test match. There is no form of bowling that makes sense when McCullum is going completely off, right? There's no way really to go. And I think that is a really, really interesting thing that's worth noting as England go forward. They're not going to be able to do this in every situation. They're not going to be able to do it all the time. In fact, if you look at this particular, these 3 tests, the ball got soft really early on over and over again. It was really a new ball, unlike normal English conditions, it was very much a new ball summer. The pitches were incredibly flat, and most importantly for England's chasers, did not degrade at all. There was the slightest bit of variable bounce, but they really didn't help the bowlers later on. New Zealand's selection policies were absolutely bizarre from beginning to end. And then on top of that, they made it worse by getting injuries. And also, I'm going to throw in just not bowling Daryl Mitchell when clearly they have to bowl Daryl Mitchell. So all those things certainly played a very, very big part in this. That said, what England did is still quite... It's still, if you look at the history of Test cricket, as far as the chases and as far as the run rates go, it's absolutely notable and it sticks out.
Yeah, it's insane. So, yeah, England's run rate this series, 4.5. Only one team has ever done that in the 3-match series, which was Australia against a very weak West Indies side in 2015. And England, scoring half an over quicker than they've ever scored before. And it's clear that they really do have a different approach here. And there is the sort of one-day thinking. I think a really important strand of this is that historically you'd often get a kind of fifth, you'd have those overs to kind of see you to the second you ball from sort of 65 to 80, and you might have guys bowling, you'd have a Daryl Mitchell. Yeah, a Daryl Mitchell type bowler would bowl to a 7-2 field and probably go for the 2.2 and over. So they probably wouldn't get a wicket, but it's not really doing much damage to you as a bowling side. And what England have done here, they've taken that out of the equation. You know, Michael Bracewell has actually got 5 wickets in 47 overs, which is a good strike rate for an off spinner. But of course, he's been hit for 300 runs. He's gone for 6 runs and over, and that in turn it just causes complete chaos. And I think there's a big value to this chaos against a team as sort of methodical and meticulous as this New Zealand team. You know, they have their plans, and suddenly they've been ripped up. And actually, I think you could argue that England's treatment of Bracewell was actually what leads to Kyle Jamieson over bowling in the second test and then getting injured, which then in turn probably cost New Zealand that test match. So against a very structured team, I think there can be a lot of value in playing with this sort of freedom. But clearly the pitches, you know, I was looking at the movement. So seam swing has never been less in English summer since 2004, when so the first was 2005 that's been tracked. It's never been less seam swing than this summer. So you couldn't have picked better conditions to do this in, and the attack, given the lack of spinner and certainly the lack of trusted spinner in the first test, has also been ideal to do this in. Plus, we've had injuries to de Gronholm and Jameson, so there's been a lot of luck which have helped, and there's been inside edges past the stumps and stuff. But in a way, this doesn't invalidate the idea of McCullum being a bit more pragmatic, because in many ways this was a perfect series to try this new approach. It's very different doing it in the sort of 2018, 2019 summers, which were terrible for batting. And, you know, guys like Jason Roy and Hales, well, they were probably quite jealous of England this summer. You know, they might not have been, they probably wouldn't have succeeded in Test cricket regardless, but they've had a lot more chance doing it on these pitches than when they played in those spicier wickets.
Yeah, I mean, any batter would feel that way, I think. And in that particular case, like, you know, Butler must have been looking at these pitches and going, this would have been handy for the way that I play. So, look, you could certainly see the difference there. I think the other interesting thing is that when McCullum took that job, I couldn't work out what his thinking was, because there was no way to fix that batting lineup, right? Like Crawley and Hamid and Burns and Lees and Sibley, and you know, there's, you know, and then a bunch of middle order guys that they've also churned through. And you and I we aren't specialists in county cricket, but we watch enough, and you see these guys that are talked up, and you're like, well, this guy's not going to star in Test match cricket. He might average 35, you know, or 30 like Rory Burns has, but there aren't those sorts of players out there. What McCullum has really done is he's been watching what England have done with the white ball game and be like, okay, but what there is out there is an actual strength of people who can hit the ball. So West Indies players probably still hit the ball harder on, you know, at the top end than the English players do. But there's never been a group of batters from one country who hit the ball as consistently for boundaries from a length, you know, from good deliveries as England players. That we're talking about all the way from, you know, the players that we all are aware of, like, you know, Butler and Bairstow and Stokes, all the way down to, you know, guys who come up and play a couple of good blast seasons and then disappear. You know, it's just ridiculous how well English players have been trained on how to hit the white ball. And, you know my theory on this, it's a combination of the T20 existing in England a lot longer than anywhere else did, playing really long tournaments, Pro 40 being around, and then the fact that if you're in the best 100, 150 players professionally in England, you have to be monumentally shit to be dropped. You know, Alex Lees averaged 17 one season and is still playing for England. I don't think that's probably going to happen if you're a you know, Sheffield or a Ranji Trophy or, you know, a franchise opener in South Africa. So I think a lot of these different things come together. But I feel that that's what McCullum saw, right? Was if all these guys can hit these balls like they are hitting them, can we not get them to do that in a test match and completely knock the shape out of international bowlers, which is what McCullum himself did?
Yeah, but also it's coming from a position of weakness in that England have tried, you know, they've tried what everyone says they should do, proper test technique, blah, blah, and it just hasn't worked at all. So if the alternative, you're trying that again and again and again, it hasn't worked. They've got through all these openers. So that's kind of like what led them to why not try this radically different thing. And obviously they kind of did half try it in 2018, which was, it was obviously the sort of total cricket team, as Ben Jones called it, which was lots of all-rounders who often did score quickly. And actually they did very well under that. That was England's best period. I think they won 7 tests out of 8 over 2018. And then they had this one car crash test in Barbados and they ripped that up and then go to more conventional again. But even that, they didn't have quite the level of intent that England have shown this series. So it's completely empowering batsmen. And I think, again, though, it's like your defences aren't very good. So I was looking at the number of balls per dismissal when defending in England, and that has been crashing down as well. And yet the number of balls per dismissal when attacking hasn't really gone down the same way. So you've got a funny thing where batsmen have probably got worse at defending and better at attacking at the same time, which means the relative risk of embracing this approach is less. And of course, you might have some car crashes with this, but you're having car crashes. You were just batting 60 overs and getting rolled for 150 anyway. So kind of what's the worst that can happen in some ways.
Yeah, there's an element of Trescothick and Vaughan, like, that sort of haunted English cricket for years. It's like, maybe we don't need to look at first-class form and we could just pick random guys. And it's like, well, you didn't end up with Trescothick and Vaughan through a good system. You ended up with them because you had tried every other warm body in England in your top order, and you didn't have a good system. It just happened to be that those two, if they had a better system, they would have noticed them earlier on or pushed them earlier on. And in some cases, they just played when they were at their peak ages as well. But when you look at this, it's really interesting. And this is the thing I want to ask you, because I've been thinking about this a lot. Obviously, we know it won't work on day 5, I was going to say Wacker, but Wacker doesn't exist anymore. But a day 5 Australian pitch that's cracked, right? Probably doesn't work. We know it's not going to work on, some of the pitches we saw in Chennai. We know it's not going to work on some of the West Indian ones where the ball doesn't, bounce above knee height. So there are certain pitches where it just won't work anyway. But on a pitch that is true, what is red ball line and length if you can't bowl it anymore, right? So the big skill of test match bowling is the fact that you can bowl a really good line and length over and over again, and maybe someone like Gilchrist or Sehwag or Viv Richards can try and knock you off your length a little bit, right? But if you are charging down the wicket, or if you are hitting that length to unconventional areas, or you're reverse scooping it, does that length even have the same impact that it once did?
I think what we might see, well, the question now is if we're seeing white ball skills in Test cricket with the bat, are we going to see more white ball skills with the ball in terms of more slower balls, more Yorkers and so on? And I actually argue New Zealand probably could have tried those options a bit more. And that'll be one of the things. I think New Zealand's, even their field settings, they didn't even try, a 7-2 offside field. They didn't even try that. And they might have just been pummeled through leg side, but that would have maybe created chances of getting a leading edge and so on. So I think New Zealand, their whole approach is very much based on controlled cricket, and therefore they're actually they're a good opposition to try this method against. I think someone like India or Australia, they would have been a bit more nimble, and their plan B might not have worked, but they would have kind of kept on coming up with more, whereas I don't feel New Zealand kind of did. But in terms of, I guess, what's sustainable, let's just say if England pitches keep on being like this, which is really different to what they've been recently, but if they keep on being like this, I think what's sustainable from this? So I think the old ball approach, is probably not quite at this level, but I think actually that really might have some legs given what Bairstow can do, what Stokes can do, what actually Root can do when he gets in. He's played in a very liberated way this way. I wouldn't be that concerned about that. I think they might be able to score at 4.5 over against the old ball, but the new ball is what really would worry me still. And that is, you'll be seeing England have 2 shocking lapses this series, a 7 for 41 at Lords and 6 for 55 at Leeds. And I think to divide up Bazball into new ball and old ball, the old ball just looks to me like it's got a lot more legs, but it probably needs the new ball being shored up a little bit. I mean, you could even say if there was a better version of Sibley or Burns, they would actually be quite good to get you to 30, 40 overs, and then you can attack. So that's my take on that. Those sort of 2 strands.
So I'm looking at it from a slightly different way, although I think what you said is great. But I think I'm thinking about it from basically what the reverse sweep does as a shot. So the reverse sweep then allows you to push the field out, and you have to have more fielders either on the boundary or in areas that you wouldn't generally want to have fielders. Once you start to do that, it changes it, and also it gives a very easy attacking scoring shot on both sides of the wicket. To no matter where you pitch the ball, even length matters a little bit more with sweeping, but line doesn't matter that much. You can reverse sweep from outside your original leg stump as you can from outside off stump or on the stumps. And then if you want to do the conventional sweep, you can do the exact same thing. If Test cricketers go to the point of what Joe Root's doing, which is you're going to bowl outside off stump to me, well, I'm now going to flip this over to slips until you can't go with that anymore. And, if you look at what Stokes is doing, so he's come, and Daryl Mitchell did it as well. This is the interesting thing. Daryl Mitchell didn't attack, but Daryl Mitchell literally changed the length by coming down the wicket every ball to the England bowlers and saying to them, you're not going to bowl the length that you want. I'm going to force it this way. If that's what Test batters are going to do now, I no longer know what the best ball is to a Test batter. And I go back to Jonty Rhodes facing Shane Warne when he was sweeping him and reverse sweeping him. And you're watching him going, what can Shane Warne do? Shane Warne's big advantage here is spinning the ball away from the outside edge. There is no longer any outside edge to be able to, or beat the inside edge. And when I watched Joe Root play that shot against Wagner, I was thinking the same thing of, they finally got the 7-2 field, which we'd all been asking for, every time they've been getting smashed. Wagner then hangs it out wide. It's clearly bothering Joe Root. And then Joe Root goes, okay, all that strategy doesn't matter anymore because I'm going to play a shot that you hadn't even thought about yet. That is the really interesting part of this. That should be able to work on kind of any pitch. That part of it, right? You should be able to scoop that bowler on any particular pitch. How often that it ends up where someone scoops the ball straight up in the air and they're caught by the wicketkeeper anyway, or they drag the ball back onto their stumps from 8 foot outside our stump might stop it. But you see what I'm saying? Literally taking away the strengths of Test bowlers.
Yeah, and the other thing is be able to play those shots, a bit like what you said on Justin Langer earlier. But if you show that you can play those shots, then suddenly you can probably score 3.5, 4 and over just in singles because you've got boundary riders everywhere. So whether you kind of scare the opposition into taking out the slips and almost forgetting to try and get you out in a normal way, that will be another potential benefit of this. So I think as a fielding team, you need to be able to think on your feet. I think you probably want more one-day variations, but you also just need to, which I think New Zealand did at times. New Zealand times when Michael Bracewell's bowling around the wicket to Joe Root, how are we trying to get this guy out? And I think New Zealand at some times, kind of at one point, it looked like their only option for wickets was being caught on the boundary. So you need to kind of keep the faith in that. Otherwise, you're road to nowhere, really.
The name of your book was, I've forgotten.
Crickonomics, The Anatomy of Modern Cricket.
Available everywhere you need it to be available. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Cheers.